Kia ora. That's showing on screen, sweet. So obviously I'm not Jo, she's unfortunately unwell, and also the presentation, as presentations tend to do when I tweak them, went through several evolutions, so I struggled to come up with a title. We're originally going to talk about the need for precision. Precision definitely matters. I think automation and collaboration also matter a lot, in large part because we think efficiency and confidence matter a lot. So really where I got to with this is that it's actually about what we see as the importance of mature infrastructure and systems for delivering all of the goals that we've been talking about over the past couple of days. So I thought I'd start by, and it's fitting that I've got the closing session, because I think this is really the equation that all of us are talking about trying to solve when we're looking at carbon forestry. How do we get our emissions, minus our removals, minus offsets, which we'll get to in a moment, down to some net position which we agree with? And as long as you include offsets in there, I think it's actually not very clear what the net position is, because offsets have had a lot of, in some cases, well-founded criticism, in my view, recently, for not actually impacting their net position. That's why I make a distinction in this equation between removals and offsets, because most of the time you hear criticism internationally about offsets, you're not talking about carbon removals, you're talking about something that's been issued for an avoided emission. Those do not neutralise emissions, they do not get us to net zero. So we prefer to look at the equation like this, focus on removals, which is the only thing that the ETS in New Zealand incentivises, has done an extremely good job of incentivising it. Arguably some of the reforms that have been discussed are the result of it doing, in some people's minds, too good a job of incentivising it, but the problem is not that it hasn't incentivised a good outcome, it's that it might be leading to other sort of externalities that we don't like. Either way though, the goal is to get this equation to zero, and I've been very happy in the past day or two, especially today, to hear the commentary around that's not actually the goal. The goal is to get it to a significant negative number, like we're about 420 parts per million at the moment. It's still going rapidly upwards. That is not a good state to be in. We want it back down around 350 or so. Like, fair enough to say that that goal is borderline impossible at the moment, but we shouldn't lose sight that it is the goal. We should figure out a way to get there, otherwise we're going to keep having problems. And the nice thing about forestry is that in using forestry to deliver the removals that get us to that goal, we get a whole bunch of other benefits alongside it, including improved water quality, improved environmental resilience, and improved biodiversity, if we do it the right way. Excuse me. So taking the global sort of perspective on this, there's, by various metrics, 1 billion hectares of potential land that could be restored to forest globally without significantly impacting agricultural productivity or other human activities in the sort of land use space. And with even reasonably conservative assumptions on average sequestration rates, that could create a carbon sink, so removals, of 5 billion tonnes per year. So clearly this is not a solution to climate change. We're going to massively need to reduce our gross emissions because they're currently ticking along at around 50 billion tonnes. But that 5 billion tonnes is not something that we should ignore as an opportunity. Like, we desperately need those removals to actually get us into a position of net negativity. Even if we got gross emissions to zero, we still want at least 5 or 10 billion tonnes a year of removals from other sources to get the total atmospheric CO2 down. But it's pretty hard to talk about these things at a global level. Really, what I'm talking about today is the pathway to 1 billion hectares and the needed infrastructure, but 1 billion hectares is pretty abstract. I think there's something like 4 billion hectares of total land international. I don't even know. What I do know is a little bit more about what we have in New Zealand, and that's what I think we're all here to focus on, is how do we achieve our domestic goals in the context of our international commitments. 2 years ago, we had around 300 hectares. Simon Petrie might correct me, or Stephen on the exact numbers here. It's roughly 300,000 hectares registered in the ETS. I think there's around 550,000 now. It's probably getting closer to 600,000 with the ongoing processing. It might be tempting to go, oh, well, you know, the Lucas assesses there being as roughly 700,000 hectares of total eligible post-89 forest. Maybe we're mostly done. I think what we really need, and there's been a lot of talk about this already, is ambitious goals. We shouldn't be aiming to just kind of barely sneak into our commitments. We shouldn't be aiming to like under-deliver on removals. I would love to see a situation in which we become a net exporter of high-integrity carbon removals to the globe. And for that, like, our number that we're picking is 2 million hectares of new forest, and I thought Jamie's summary just now was quite apt. It could be significantly more than that if we have a flexible mind and a flexible definition of what forest we expect. Silver pasture could result in far more than that. But it's probably going to be in a different sort of environment to where we've seen much of the forest so far. So this is not a graph that's informed by any data other than me Googling power law distribution. But my expectation is, and this is borne out in a lot of the stats and a lot of what we're seeing in new applications, up until now, the most compelling investment case for carbon forestry has been if you have a lot of forest and it's all yours. So one registrant with a lot of area. I think we've made a pretty good dent, certainly in terms of the existing forest that exists in that category. I think we should expect that a lot of the future forest that could become eligible and could be the beneficiary of various carbon incentives will be in the long tail of opportunities. So smaller areas of forest across a larger number of participants. If we were to get to the point that all of the 50,000-ish so-called farms in New Zealand were active carbon foresters, which I think should be our ambition in various different forms, including soil carbon, for example, we'd have at least, I say at least, I don't know the precise number, but I think it's at least 20 times our current ETS participants. And given that we do want to enable all of these, they're going to be across marginal land areas with mosaic land use, biodiverse forest, and most of these characteristics result in higher levels of complexity in the registration than if it's just a big area of monoculture pine that you can easily put a ring around, know the age, know when it was planted, and know the relatively simple ongoing management regime in terms of your accounting obligations under the ETS. And if we want this to be successful in the face of all of this activity, we still need to deliver high integrity so that we actually preserve the sort of trust of the broader market and maintain our social license to do what we're doing and don't end up with situations like foresters being effectively disenfranchised because the broader community has decided at a political level that forest is bad. I mean, I strongly believe that's not the case. I think that the removals that we're delivering as an industry are valuable and should be recognised as such, but there is a social license aspect to consider. It also needs to be extremely clear and transparent what every single one of these commitments that landholders make are, because, as has been mentioned, they're making a multi-year, multi-decade/permanent commitment. If they get into it not fully understanding what they're getting into, it's extremely dangerous for their overall, especially economic impact, but also possibly the long-term forest management. The framework needs to be reliable. This that is very true for pricing predictions as well. Like, we need stable carbon prices so that people can rely on them and have economic cases that make sense. But the tooling needs to be reliable as well so that it drives adoption, minimises surprises. And finally, it needs to be efficient, because we're talking about incentive frameworks here. We want most of the money going to the activity that we actually want to incentivise, which is the removal of carbon and the durability of that removed carbon. Ideally, we'd avoid having a huge amount of the money going into various kind of overheads of delivery of that, including the infrastructure. So the infrastructure needs to be cost effective. So the rest of this tale is really a bit of a story of our progress so far, which in large parts is a tale of trying to do all of this for in most parts, relatively small landholders. We've got around 300 so far on the system, and the average size is around, I just need to do the maths, average size is about 50 hectares. The median size is probably more like 20 hectares. So we're dealing with a lot of smaller properties. And that's caused us a lot of pain because we didn't have mature tools for delivering these projects and managing their life cycles. And so we've been working to create them. So I guess no one believes this, but I wondered this when I first started working on this in September of 2020. We knew that we had some machine vision models that could recognise vegetation from various remote sensing data. We thought there could be a possibility to apply that to support the carbon sector. I thought that there wouldn't be, because I thought it's a 10-year-old sector, it would be mature, this would be a solved problem. And we routinely talked to farmers, just started a basic market screening, talked to 10 farmers. Every single one of those farmers knew about the ETS, had looked into registering, and had stopped because they didn't know if they had any entitlements, and it all just seemed too complicated. And every single one of them had entitlements that would give them $10,000 a year, which was a significant figure for all of them. It's not like they knew and they didn't care. They knew roughly, and they couldn't figure out how to do it with certainty. And so for an incentive market to be effective, the incentive needs to be a lot bigger than the friction to engaging with it. And the friction is really various forms of overheads. So what we found was that the friction, you've sort of got your farmer who is maybe a bit too stereotypical that he's wearing overalls, but anyway, some person who's got some forest, and they want to get their forest to the market for the incentives that their forest could earn so that they're motivated to create more forest. But there's all of these issues that they have to face in getting there, and left to their own devices, we found that they often got lost partway through and just walked away from it and gave up. Our vision was to create something which basically wrapped that up. It doesn't conceal the complexity, because the complexity is actually very important to people making an informed decision, but it at least presents the complexity in a way that they can easily digest and understand what's going on. And the first thing we discovered was that from a landholder's perspective, even thinking about starting this process was pretty hard. Like, just to go from the point of, I've heard about the ETS to, I'm doing something about the ETS, however little. So we wanted to try and make it easy to start. We created a website which anybody could go to and just click on their land and request a free assessment of the carbon potential of their land. And at the peak of that being available, we got 250 assessments in a single day, which was a big complication for us, because as we discovered at step 2, this stuff gets complicated very quickly. The grand vision that we had was basically a combination of remote and local sensing data, plus bespoke deep learning models that we've developed internally, plus an integrated geospatial processing platform and a whole heap of custom rules, all pulled together into a project automation and reporting framework that anybody could interact with and could get an easy understanding of not just what they've got, but also the full process to getting that realised and getting the incentives to actually work effectively. However, what we started out with was something which is probably in various forms pretty familiar to all of you, is a whole bunch of cobbled together bits and pieces of Excel and Word and, well, we're a Google Docs company, so it's not Excel and Word, but, and email and QGIS and HubSpot, which was our customer relationships manager. And we just struggled along testing our ideas by cobbling those together to deliver outputs that were directionally aligned with what we wanted to give to people, but in an extremely labour-intensive way. And then that went through several versions up to sort of version 7 billion or whatever, which is roughly where we are now. There's been a lot of iteration here, but the general vision was like, try something out, iterate on it, improve it, and automate it where we can. We were trying to keep a high-quality landholder experience the whole way through, because this is people's land. You've got to make sure you're doing it right for them. The thing is that early on, our unit economics were just atrocious. Like, it cost us an enormous amount to deliver that experience to the user. But we were okay with that, because as long as we had the confidence that we could automate it in time, that's all right. Like, we're building for the long term. A couple of the areas that we encountered, which are probably very familiar to those of you who've supported people through this process. Starting off just generating an assessment. The left one here is what we started out with, which was sort of a Word doc cobbled together version supported by a whole heap of just manual GIS mapping and then calculations in Excel. On the right, we've got more like what we generate now, which importantly is generated fully automatically. Like, nobody has to do anything for that to come up, aside from verify the actual land segmentations that have occurred, which, like, a lot of it's done by AI. We don't trust the AI output. We verify it before we actually show it to a user. And it means that we've gone from sort of hours to prepare an assessment to minutes to prepare an assessment, which means that, again, we're driving efficiency, and this can lead to cost savings for the landholder. We quickly found that generating an assessment wasn't even necessarily the most time-consuming part, because it's complicated. Actually explaining the assessment to the person who's received it required an enormous amount of investment in just the way that it was presented, the data that you made available to them, the way that they could discover the various depths of data that they had, and could actually, like, start with a high-level thing. How much money is this going to make me? Because if you're presenting it to a farmer and you say, we've assessed that you might receive $700 a year, it's very simple for them just to go, cool, good to know, I'll move on. You need a hook to begin with, which is this is your potential. But then this is not a free ride. It comes with a huge amount of ongoing liabilities. You're basically choosing to lock your land up. Like, we talk about averaging versus permanent. Anybody who's looked at the ETS economics knows that all of your ETS forest is pretty much permanent, because there's no way you can afford to deforest it at a carbon price of $80 or $100 a tonne. You're going to be keeping it in forest. And helping people understand that so that they don't kind of go, oh, well, might as well take the money since it's there, and then get hit with a liability they didn't expect 3 years later or 50 years later, was really important to us. We then, there's never just one option that you have. We had to build out, help people explore the different scenarios. Like, of all of the 50 different areas across my farm, what are the implications of registering each one of those or not registering it? Because it's not like it's all or nothing. You can pick and choose what you want to get involved with and what you leave on the table. And putting tooling in place that could allow people to build that level of understanding efficiently was important for us to be able to deliver a solution efficiently. And doing it all in a way that was heavily automated, reviewable, testable, repeatable, auditable, so that we knew that the advice that was coming out the end of this stuff was reliable. Collecting evidence, another key step. Initially, we just had people go out and take photos themselves with phones and occasionally drones, but we really wanted to empower the people who are on the land every day and who know the land well to collect evidence that met all of the MPI requirements in terms of the metadata that came with the evidence. So we've now got to the point that you can define all of the sample locations that are needed within the application itself, and then we've built a companion application, which we call Field Scan, which farmers can download, and it ensures that the photos that they're collecting of the field include all of the data that's required to make that photo valid from an evidential perspective for a registration application. Actually preparing the applications themselves, I won't go through this, but it's a big process. You don't want to make mistakes. You want to make sure that everything you're submitting is compliant from a geometrical perspective and has the relevant evidence. And again, this is something that we wanted to automate so that we could actually have tests associated with the outputs of our application generation, so that it was a lot more reliable and we'd end up with sort of reliable acceptance rates for the most part, and at least the confidence that what we were submitting was complete and spec compliant. Then you wait a few months, depending on the timing of your submission, and you get a result of that application, which is again a decision point, or at least at a point where you need to update your assumptions, because routinely, especially with native forest registrations, you don't get 100% acceptance, and the carbon price could have changed in the interim. So again, there's another interaction with a landholder, which is really critical to get right, because now, I mean, many of our customers are actually, like restoration of native forest, maybe one of their predominant land activities, which means that this is critical for their financial forecasts to know how much am I actually going to get on what time frame with what variabilities. Again, we wanted to automate it, which has now been done. We finished all of that, and then as of January this year, based on the registrations that we had completed prior to December 31st, we had 200 mandatory emissions returns to file, which again, like extremely important for the landholder, also extremely important to do right, because if you get it wrong, firstly, you're likely to end up with lost unit liabilities or delays, but secondly, if you get it wrong, there's huge penalties in place, which I completely agree that there should be huge penalties in place, because otherwise you create massive perverse incentives. But for starters, we were just wondering, like, is there a risk that we miss any forest loss despite the good intent of every actor within the system? Because sometimes you can. So we trained another AI model to work with hyperspectral satellite imagery to scan every single CAA we had registered and detect any potential instance of forest loss in any one of those CAAs. And when they came up, they got flagged for manual review. On the first day that we put that live, 5 days before we were going to submit our first MERs by hand, because we put a few in early, it flagged unknown forest loss on a property that we had had confirmation from the landholder had no forest loss and that we hadn't seen in our own manual review, because we're reviewing thousands of hectares just from aerial imagery. Which was an easy fix, because we could go back to the landholder and say, hey, what about that there? And they said, oh yeah, I didn't actually realise you'd registered that part. I cleared that for my house site. It's like, well, we did register it. Good thing you told us. We can now, firstly, we're going to update the MER to declare that as deforested, and also now we can do a part remove CAA so that your house is no longer a registered forest area, because it's soon going to be defined as deforested. Which meant that it was very painless. Nobody was upset. They completely understood the situation. But much better to be in that scenario than in a scenario where, God forbid, we got a call from MPI sometime down the track saying, I noticed that you claimed 700 tonnes on something that's a house. We don't have building carbon sequestration systems yet, so you're in trouble. And we have to do this repeatedly across now 300 sections. We don't want to be making mistakes here. Even the process of actually engaging with the landholder and helping to communicate to them everything that they need to know from us was something where we wanted to be able to automate it. So there's a whole series of questions that go through that somewhat mirror what's in Tupuake, but include, firstly, it's going directly to the landholder, rather than having an email train to verify the interaction with them and who said what and what was requested. We actually integrated into the app so that they can tell us what they've done, verify what they haven't done, notify us of any impacts, and we can tell them directly in an upcoming iteration, we detected possible deforestation in these 7 CAAs. Can you please review these and tell us what happened here in addition to our review? And then finally get to the point that we run our own internal calculations of the carbon yield that we expect for the CAAs and compare them against what's automatically generated in Tupuake. And in this case, I forget, sorry, I made it too small to see, but it was out by a couple, which is why there's that big warning sign there saying something's gone wrong. And this was in the early days of the Tupuake update, where there were a couple of various off by 1 areas due to the implementation that we had versus the Tupuake spec versus the Tupuake internal implementation. Most of the time now that just matches up perfectly, but as those of you who've submitted a return through Tupuake, you'll remember the message that says, I'm paraphrasing, this calculation of the carbon entitlements for these areas are not definitive or anything that you can kind of point the finger at MPI and say, well, you told me it had 700 tonnes, therefore the obligation's on you. The obligation is still on the preparer to make sure that that number's correct, so having a cross-check was extremely important. And now we're in the situation where we've got 300 plus accounts to manage and help people trade their carbon when they want to and make sure that we stay compliant with the financial markets authorities, because like our advice is that independent of any changes to the FMA, NZUs are already a security. If you're supporting people in the management or trading of NZUs, you should be a registered financial service provider, which we now are because of this. But quite aside from that, it's just a massive administrative burden. And the more we can build out this tooling to give our customers reliable access to the information in a self-serve model, rather than them having to call us up or email us and setting aside the security issues with an email-based interaction model, the better it's going to be. And then there was the other forest, which complicated our lives even further. This is an area of regenerating native forest on Banks Peninsula. 37 hectares of it was declared eligible for the ETS, meaning there's another 120 hectares of pre-90 assessed Indigenous regenerating native forest, most of which is still sequestering carbon, which isn't recognised under the ETS and isn't eligible for incentives. And as Sean was talking about earlier, like the market for this stuff is still not very liquid. What we're pushing for is that all of the ongoing removals in that forest will be fully recognised within the ETS. There's been some encouraging feedback from the various removal consultations and ag pricing consultations in that direction. Overall, I would far prefer us to have compliance markets with a high degree of certainty than voluntary carbon markets, but we see the voluntary markets as an opportunity for innovation and trying to provide examples of what could work better for the future of compliance markets. But one of the critical constraints is that if you're interacting in both the voluntary carbon markets and the compliance carbon markets, you better be damn sure that you don't get your numbers mixed up, because one of the mortal sins is basically, are your removals accurate? Are they durable? And have you not double counted them? And there's nothing that will annoy someone more than finding out that you've sold them in a voluntary capacity under a voluntary framework, units that you've also claimed under the ETS and sold off to Genesis Energy to support some coal emissions. So having records that are auditable and traceable and measurable to ensure that doesn't happen is critical. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we sort of got into our financial compliance considerations for trading, various issues around how we provide advice, how we maintain records of that advice, how we retain the data that was associated with the advice that we gave in an auditable form over time. And then the rules change. And you've got 300 odd sets of accounts that you've distributed that need an update, whether that's because the price has changed or the accounting methodology has changed, or as with some of the upcoming consultations, perhaps the lookup table associated with your species has changed. And managing all of this with Excel is not a situation that we wanted to be in. So this is really what became clear as we went through it, is you're getting into a multi-decade engagement for the landholder. Whether it's a multi-decade engagement with us or not as a service provider is an open question, but the landholder's in this for a long, long time. And you need to have a reliable way to deliver a high quality of service across that entire period into both the voluntary market and compliance carbon market. So we took a step back and we've been thinking mostly of landholders and markets, but we came to appreciate that there's a lot of other actors in this ecosystem that are involved in it working well. And there's also a lot more than one landholder in many cases, there's often thousands. And this introduces a whole heap of other considerations in terms of like efficient, high integrity, reliable, stable delivery around continuity of services and registry management and data management and sort of how you do your engagement. And then we started talking to a lot of forestry consultants and found that many of them were achieving all of these outcomes in a fairly high quality way, but using the tool set that we'd started out with or close to it, like email and Word doc templates and Excel doc templates and phone calls. And none of them were particularly happy about it, but it's sort of what other situation was in place. And our goal is to get to the point that our framework is more generally available to the industry to help deliver these projects in a high quality way. We're a software company. My background is in engineering and software development. I'm not a forester by training, and I don't aspire to be a forestry consultant because there's millions of forestry consultants who know a lot more about this than me and are better people for a landholder to talk to. We want to be developing technology platforms that help this market progress and become more efficient and mature. I saw this probably about 3 months ago, and it really spoke to me as, like, we're a startup company as well, so I've done a lot of fundraising over the last 2 years, and I felt very seen here. It was like, yeah, there's this whole edifice, but a lot of what I'm talking to you about hinges on an Excel sheet that I created and a PowerPoint that I'm presenting to you, much as I'm presenting now. And then I thought, this is really not so different from the carbon forestry sector. Like, I think what the industry does is enormously complicated and critical, but it's like resting on a lot of these sort of quite generic technologies. There are like specific ones coming along, but there's a lot there that's just kind of still, this is the best tool that I could find for the job, and everything stands on top of that. Our aspiration, which is somewhat less holistic than this indicates, you'll see in a moment, but is really to provide a more customized tool for a part of that ecosystem. In doing so, we hope to basically help landholders unlock more carbon incentives, which means that they will protect and restore more forests, which means that there is less carbon in the atmosphere, and means that there are more carbon incentives available, which means that they will invest those carbon incentives into protecting and restoring more forest, which is, interestingly, like, you just need to look at the ETS for forestry to understand that incentive markets work. You don't necessarily need to enforce on somebody that they have to, like, if they receive money, they must take certain actions with the spending of that money. All you have to do is, like, link up the outcome that you want to the incentive that you're delivering. And if the outcome that you want is high integrity, durable carbon removals, and you pay people for that, there's a very good chance that you'll get more of it. Something that we were very gratified to find earlier this year is that the voluntary carbon units that we issued and were paid for last year, 100% of those funds were reinvested back into further forest restoration. Not because we required people to as part of the methodology, we just said, you're being paid for durable carbon removals that you don't double sell. So they better be durable, they better be carbon removals, and you better not sell them to anyone else. But you can do what you like with the money, that's up to you. But they just followed the incentive effect and were like, that was a great outcome. I'm going to create more durable carbon removals because I see a market for it and I like markets. However, we are not arrogant or naive enough to think that we are the only actor in this space, or that we're going to be that giant green block down the bottom. We are a fairly small part of this puzzle, and sort of putting a broader bow on this whole thing, my real appeal is to, firstly, that we should invest in systems and infrastructure to make sure that this market works well and is efficient, and secondly, that we should invest in interoperability between those systems and infrastructure, because if we end up with silos, usually, like, there's a litany of examples of that being a pretty bad outcome. It tends not to lead to transferability. You get people sort of stuck in certain situations. A provider goes under, they end up in a whole heap of chaos as they try and change. We'd like standardized data formats, and I actually have to call out MPI as a positive factor in this, because one of the very good things that they've done is create a standardized format in the shapefile template for the submission of an ETS registration and the result of an ETS registration, which means that all of us as an industry have had to standardize around that as a potential data exchange format. Our platform now allows you to directly import your shapefiles and gives you all of these reports basically without any further configuration, because we've had a standardized data type. And it'd be great to see that for a whole heap of the other stuff that's coming up looking ahead as we consider new unit types, new market structures, new accounting methods, new monitoring and measurement frameworks. Like, standardizations here is good. We really need new infrastructure in our view for this next step, and we need it to be interoperable so the next step works well. So in closing, like, this is the platform that we've built and are building. It's helped us an enormous amount. We are planning to make it generally available to the sector. We want to be a technology provider, not a services provider, and we hope it can help you. And if you're interested in giving it a try, then please hit me up or go to our website. Thanks very much for your time.